had to learn over years how wrong it was, what I did, and how much pain I caused you. I'm sorry. It hurts me how senseless it was because he was always such a good friend to me.
You have any tears coming down your face?
Yes, I had tears coming down my face.
Because I haven't seen you wipe your nose or wipe an eye.
An unthinkable tragedy unfolding right now at Southwood Middle School in Miami-Dade.
Is there any particular reason why you did this?
No, there's not.
Do you know what you did is wrong?
Yes, I do.
Are you sorry that this happened today?
No, I'm not.
I feel horrible about what I did. I had to learn over years how wrong it was.
Mike, what's your birthday?
February 2nd, 1990.
Happy birthday. So you just turned 14?
Yes, I did.
Very good. What were your intentions yesterday?
My intentions yesterday were to kill Andre. I was gonna stab him in the back and stab here, and that would have been it. Me, Andre, Jamie, and myself were in the bathroom.
How old is Andre?
He is 13.
What grade is Andre in?
He is in the 8th grade.
Is he a friend of yours?
Yes, he is.
His tone is, detached, factual. When we speak with emotion in our voice, what we're actually doing is expressing how we feel, which is why the voice is so reflective and expressive and modulates. If we don't experience a richness of emotions, then our voice is going to be somewhat flat or somewhat controlled.
I was going to strangle him first, and then after he was dead, I was going to make sure by stabbing him.
Okay, and this was Andre.
This was Andre.
One of the characteristics of psychopathy is that they're manipulative. They have a goal, they have an agenda. They don't share it with you necessarily, but they're constantly monitoring the environment around them to see how, when, and if it provides them an opportunity to go ahead and do what they want to do.
His journal is really interesting. You see him exploring identities of serial killers and mass murderers. He starts to make plans, and then this clear fantasies where he's drawing how he'd like to kill his victims.
At the bottom, he's written, "Will become a serial killer."
Now, did you lure him into the bathroom yesterday?
Into the bathroom, yes, not the stall. I told them both that we were going to be late to class. And so we snuck upstairs after the late bell had rung. We got to the bathroom, and I was trying to convince Andre to go into the stall.
Okay. And how were you going to do that?
I told him that I had something to show him. His response, he didn't want to do it, so he said no. He's like, why can't Jamie go first? My response then was that he's going to go next.
Okay. Now, did Jamie agree? Did Jamie say, I'll come in, I'll look?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And what did you say at that point?
I said no, he's going to go first.
Okay. And any particular reason why?
I wanted to get Andre killed first. I said, are you gonna guys cooperate tomorrow? They're like, yeah, okay, we'll cooperate tomorrow.
All right. And you went off to class?
Yes.
If you're egocentric, then you can manipulate the reality as you want, feed it in the way that you want. He had a plan, and the plan had an order to it. And Andre didn't buy it. Andre didn't trust him. And when the plan didn't go as it worked, he couldn't adjust immediately. The anticipation of the killing probably gave him intense pleasure. He wants to get it right, and getting it right is exciting. The actual planning is very exciting.
What were your intentions today?
I would have talked him into coming to the bathroom with me, coming into the stall. Then I would have proceeded to slit his throat and stab him continuously until he died in the neck area.
Yes.
And then I would have left him there.
Yes.
And gone back downstairs and talked Jamie into coming upstairs, lured him into the other bathroom, and slit his throat and stabbed him in the neck.
Today, who did you meet at the fence?
I met Jamie Coffey.
Why did you try to why did you make the suggestion to Jamie to go inside the school today?
I was planning to murder him.
How long have you had this plan?
A little under a week.
Michael Hernandez is one of those individuals that I think it's easy to find really distressing and disturbing, because we'd all like to imagine that children are good people. And then it's only as they grow up that maybe they adopt antisocial behavior and do harmful and dangerous things. And so in spite of all the evidence that children can be violent, mean to one another, and do horrible things to one another, we really prefer to see children as rather innocent. His case, I think, really highlights the way in which young people, pre-pubertal or going through puberty, can be highly dangerous, highly organized, and be quite psychopathic at that age. And I think what people would prefer not to believe that.
I was going to get him into the stall, the last stall, because it's the biggest, so I'd have more room. I got him into the stall by saying, look, I have something to show you. So I got him into the stall, and I told him to turn around because I wanted it to be a surprise. Before that, I put on the gloves. He saw me put on the gloves, and I said, oh, that.
Oh, you're going to do that.
He might be getting more excited at remembering what he did and reliving the incident. Not all psychopaths want to tell their story. Those are the ones we don't catch. And then there's the sort that have more narcissistic traits, who want witnesses, who want admiration, who want people to see how smart, how violent, how callous, how special they are.
Now, what transpired next?
Okay, I was talking to him, and I told him, all right, now, I have to put my hand over your mouth.
Okay. Once you did that, what happened next?
I took the knife out, and I proceeded to slit his throat.
Did Jamie say or do anything? Did he put up a struggle?
Yes, he did. He turned around after I did that. He asked me not to kill him. So I told him, okay, I'm not going to cooperate.
Okay.
Which was a lie.
Right.
And so I realized that the stall door was open, so I locked it.
We see that lying comes very easy to psychopaths. People who have psychopathy, they do not feel a sense of guilt or shame. That lying is simply in the service of still getting you to do what they want. That's a very slick automatic response, and he has no intention of not killing him. He has no intention of letting him live, but he figures that'll probably keep him from panicking.
And then I turned him around again and proceeded to stab him.
And where did you stab him, Mike?
I'm not positively sure, but I'm guessing around the jugular vein, right around here. That's
Okay.
what I was aiming for.
Now, after you did that, what happened?
I left, I took my gloves off, and I flushed them down the toilet.
All right. Now, you said you had gone out and you washed your hands.
Yes. I put the knife was broken because of the stab wounds, and I couldn't close it back, so I closed it as much as I could, and I put it in my jacket pocket.
Okay.
I proceeded to go to the sink, and I wiped some of the blood off the jacket, took the jacket off. No, I did not.
He's becoming more animated as he speeds up, and he's talking about it.
He might be getting more excited at remembering what he did and reliving the incident, because that moment is just intoxicating, it's exhilarating. And Hernandez didn't expect to feel that excited or that alive.
And is there any specific reason why you planned this?
No, there's not.
Why did you choose Jamie, your friend?
He was the easiest out of anybody because he would have followed me because we're such good friends. And I knew he would have followed me in there and done what I would have said.
He has no empathy, therefore he has no loyalty, and he has no attachment. So he was simply someone that he felt he could successfully dominate and kill.
Let me ask you this. Is there any particular reason why you did this to Jamie?
No, there's not.
Did he offend you in any way?
No, he did not.
Do you think what you did is right or wrong?
No, I don't.
Well, what don't you think?
I think it is neither right, but I don't think it was wrong.
Do you know what you did is wrong?
Yes, I do.
Are you sorry that this happened today?
No, I'm not.
He believes what he's doing is right, but he knows it's legally wrong. We're all adhering to rules of morality and a moral value to something, and he's saying, yeah, that's not my rule.
In the courtroom today, Michael Hernandez, now 17, the accused killer.
You took his life. Why, Michael? Why? He was your friend, Michael. He was your friend.
The state told jurors the murder was carried out by a 14-year-old who knew right from wrong because he tried hiding the crime.
The defendant is guilty of first-degree murder as charged.
With that verdict, Michael Hernandez sat silent, emotionless, staring straight at a jury that just sent him to prison for life.
I had to learn over years how wrong it was.
What was stupid was you didn't think that I was smart enough to listen to your calls.
You know, what more do you want from me?
For sure. Go, why don't you practice your weekend learning how to cry?
Oh my God. Yeah, man.
Oh my God.
And it hurts me how senseless it was because he was always such a good friend to me.
Any tears coming down your face?
Yeah, tears coming down my face.
Because I haven't seen you wipe your nose or wipe an eye.
I think he's feeling annoyed. She's poking at him. She's saying, you're lying. And I think he probably thinks he did a pretty good job of trying to sound sorry. I mean, that is one difficulty that psychopaths really can't appreciate. Since they have no empathy, they often can't appreciate how they're perceived because they're shallow affect. And that's what you'd call his attempt at crying. It's got the form of it, but there's no feeling. I don't think he believes it's wrong, but he's learned how to say it over the years that what he did was wrong.
The facade that you see is not the facade that he is.
So, I think I told you last time that because, you know, I'm supposed to be going up for my resentencing in August. It just seems like such a needless formality that put me through another psychological interview. I've been interviewed by so many psychologists and psychiatrists over the years, it's ridiculous. And, you know, what more do you want from me? My judge, who happens to be your former prosecutor, is totally on the state side, which is really bad. He's a piece of
Well, why don't you practice your weekend learning how to cry?
Oh my God. God, man, I may have to stab myself.
Oh my God.
I try to bring a sharp object to the interview. You have something in your hand, Mr. Hernandez? No. Stab. Oh, see, I can cry.
I'm human, I swear. Look at these tears.
When I have life-threatening wounds, I can cry.
Oh, Lordy.
Got a paper clip in there?
No, ma'am.
Got a knife?
No, ma'am.
How'd you muster up those tears?
I feel horrible about what I did.
The remorse you show because you think, quote, the judge is a piece of right?
No, ma'am, I don't think that.
You said that, though, right?
I did say it, and it was a horrible, stupid thing to say.
What was stupid was you didn't think that I was smart enough to listen to your calls.
He doesn't even apologize to the judge, which, you know, if I said something really stupid and now I know this person has decision-making capacity, it might say, I really apologize for that. It was disrespectful. People who have psychopathy don't feel that. They do not feel a sense of guilt or shame.
It was funny because he used to dig up bodies and he was making a skin suit. That's a crazy.
So I think that exchange is really telling that he doesn't get it. And she's...
The worst thing that would happen is, like, imagine you're a serial killer and you're killing all these people and someone else gets all the credit. How crappy would that be?
In my profession, we say we're not really sure what remorse is or how you measure it. We all think we know what we're talking about. We say, well, you're sorry for what you did and you won't do it again. But what we realize is that in the courtroom, a jury or a judge is looking for signs of that. In these courtroom situations, they're looking for a sign that would reassure them this individual will be safe to let out. For the psychopaths, most of them can't generate enough feeling to be persuasive. There's a few that can, but it's pretty rare, especially if the crime's been pretty horrific and graphic. And in this case, in the courtroom, when you see him apparently crying, you're not really sure what to make of it. There's no tears, but he's sort of making sobbing sounds. And it doesn't really come across as genuine, even saying, I'm so sorry.
I'm compelled to reach a conclusion that I never wanted to reach. And that conclusion is that the defendant, Michael Hernandez, today is essentially the same kind of person he was in 2004. Accordingly, the court adjudicates the defendant guilty of the first-degree murder of Jamie Goff and sentences him to life in prison.
It was something, terrifying because look at the, 12 years ago, and he hasn't changed. He has not changed. He's there the same way or worse.
Are you sorry that this happened today?
No, I'm not.
Have I forced you to give this statement, sir?
No, you have not.
Thank you, sir. I have no further questions.
What type of person you think would do this?
No, I haven't given that much thought. But, I mean, cold.
Well, we were quite scared, to tell you the truth, and this is really, you know, for something like this to happen in a small town like this, you just can't believe it.
3 people are dead from multiple stab wounds, and state police are calling their deaths a homicide.
At this point in time, we haven't determined who it is, so we don't know where they may be headed to.
Jesse just said he was scared. The families don't need to know that.
No, we do. You feel you did the right thing by killing Jeff?
I feel like the world's a better place without Jeff Ryan. Good things could grow where evil was destroyed.
All right, have a seat. You understand you're not under arrest?
Yes, I understand.
Okay.
I mean, I'd be a little bit shocked if I were under arrest, to tell you the truth.
So would I, but...
And I'm here to cooperate.
We're going to talk about what type of person would do this. Is cold, greedy, heartless.
Someone just with no love for life. No love for things that grow. And I mean, what we know about Tolkien and Tolkien's writing, it's, you know, his main themes are hope and hopelessness and a love for things that grow. He was very much against the Industrial Revolution and stuff like that. Anything that took away from nature, took away from life.
You said your Hobbit is your favorite show?
Book. Bilbo Baggins.
I'm sorry?
Yeah, Bilbo Baggins.
By bringing Tolkien into the conversation, he's deflecting in a lot of ways. He's sort of leading them down a path that has nothing to do with why he would be there. I think at the core of the psychopathic personality is the desire to control. You learn to manipulate very well and to not feel guilty, certainly, about manipulating.
You can often get more information from a psychopath if you're willing to be flexible in your interview. In some ways, let them take control and lead the interview, and then weave in and out and try to get more information that way.
Can you think of any good reason for something like this to happen?
Any good reason for something like this to happen? No. I cannot think of any good reason something like that could happen.
The idea that he would shake his head yes when he's saying no is another tell.
No.
A lot of times during interrogations, people's body language runs contrary to what they're actually saying.
What often, in my experience, makes psychopaths better at lying is the glib and superficial charm that they're able to use as part of that. They come across very likable.
Let's talk about how you met Jeff.
He came over to Barbara Joyce. He came over a couple days after I got there. They introduced me. They said, "Oh yeah, this is Nate." I was like, "Oh, nice to meet you." I shook his hand. Because I never met him.
And you guys hit it off? I hit it off?
Yeah, we get along. I asked him if he could find me any work, and I went back up to check and see if he had any work, if he had heard anything. He didn't know of anything. He's mowing the lawn. He stopped mowing the lawn, talked to me, invited me in. Said, have a beer. I come in and I have a beer with him, and he shows me around the house. And that's the only visit, though, that I've made to Jeff.
You said you went there after that very first time you met him.
But really, that was the week later, just to be simple.
Uh-oh. At this point, his story has changed, and it's not uncommon that individuals who are psychopathic are overly confident in their ability to just shift and fool the other person that they're talking to. So he's not very apologetic about changing his story.
Why would you do that? Why would you confuse me like that? I confuse easy.
Because it's irrelevant. Because it's...
Well, it's not really irrelevant because you get 3 people dead. So that's why it makes it very relevant.
I understand.
Especially when people are not telling the truth.
I understand, but I mean, I had nothing to do with it. Here we have the kitchen bar. There's your refrigerator where I got the beer. Here's the door to the house. Here's the porch. There's a bathroom. And there's a bedroom.
He's drawing, he's holding the pen. He has let the investigator's letting the defendant be in control, or the suspect here be in control. And he's, in this interrogation, actually, I felt like they did do a really good job overall, sort of taking a one-down position. We know less than you. You educate us about this situation. And I think if you can see Mr. Ormsby he's in an educational stance. He's at the whiteboard, he's got the marker. It's almost as if he's trying to teach the investigator about what went on. And again, from an interviewing perspective, that's a really great way to try to elicit rapport so that the psychopath will even want to talk to you and disclose this information.
Okay, now you're inside the house here, and it was just you and Jeff in that house? Because you said you never met Jason.
I've never met Jason.
Okay, have you ever heard of Jason? Did you go down in here? No. How do you know it was a bathroom there? You drew that.
Because I asked.
Did you go to the bathroom?
No.
Why not?
I didn't have to go to the bathroom.
Why did you ask where the bathroom was?
In case I needed to go to the bathroom.
Are you kidding me?
Most animals, when they're cornered, attack, counterattack. And depending on how prone to violence they are, they might become violent. They can also resort to what has been referred to as kind of that psychopathic double talk. They're really sort of just wrapping words around sort of an empty vessel, twisting it into a pretzel, and they leave you trying to figure out what it is they're saying.
So this event here, where you were inside, was about a week before this murder happened?
Maybe 2.
Maybe 2 weeks. Never met Jason?
Never met Jason.
Well, now we have a problem.
Why?
All right. Inside that trailer, there's a bottle sitting there, 3 bottles. And in that trailer also, we have your DNA and fingerprints on one of the bottles.
I think he probably is aware it's going to be very tricky to get out of DNA. And it's possible he's also thinking, yeah, it's okay. They think they got me there, but I'll still find another way to get around this.
See this picture?
Yes.
3 bottles, right? This one's yours. One of these is Jason. and one of these is Jeff. But you see my problem. This bottle here belongs to Jason, who you never met.
Whom I've never met.
No way in hell that bottle sat there for 2 weeks. If anything, it sat there for a couple hours. So we have a problem with that. I need you to explain to me why it is that beer bottle's there at the time of the murder.
I think psychopaths tend to be good liars. They certainly don't feel a sense of guilt. And depending on how bright they are, you know, that's when they can mess up.
You were in that house a couple hours before the murder. Just tell me how this all happened. Jane, I want the truth.
Beyond lies at this point, so I'll be willing to tell you everything you want to know. I'm sorry, London? Perhaps I do need a lawyer. This is the first time I've cried.
Yeah. But I know it's a lot to absorb, buddy. It's a lot to process.
I am struck by what appears to be shallow affect, and that's one of the traits of psychopathy. And that's sort of, oh, I know something bad's happening or sad, so I should cry, so I'm gonna cry. There's not a lot of depth to his, apparent sadness here.
Well, obviously, I wasn't planning on getting caught.
Walk me through it.
I'm already guilty. I might as well.
Right.
I think we should start with why.
Okay.
Because of the things he's done to other people. Because of what he is. Was.
So you hated Jeff because he was a drug dealer?
Yeah, I smoke weed, but I don't believe in drugs like that.
Right. Unfortunately, Jason was there.
Fortunately, Jason and Jesse were there. Jesse was in the living room. And he was playing video games.
I have to ask you, because curiosity's killing me. When you got there and you knew that there were 2 other people there, what made you continue?
Courage. I mean, I went and I said said to myself I was going to do it. I had it in my mind that I was going to do it.
Another person might have said, I know where he lives, I've been invited in, I'm gonna hang out, I'll come back another day and revisit this, but he felt compelled to stay and kill 3 people. It is cold and calculated, and there's not even pseudo-emotion. There's no attempt at revulsion at what he did.
What made you continue?
I had it in my mind that I was going to break the molds of society and commit such a thing, and I had picked my targets because they were bad people.
I think it just speaks to his callous lack of regard for humanity. He made up his mind. He had a goal. He was going to take Jeff out, and the rest is just collateral damage. It's too bad they had to be there, is the attitude he seems to portray.
For the psychopath, they typically know basically why they're doing what they're doing, but his explanation is intellectual, and to me, it doesn't hold water, really. It doesn't tie in at all to the amount of rage this guy really has.
Everything was going fine, and I've been talking about spending the winter in the forest, just camping out, building a hut.
Sure.
And he said, oh, I got nails.
He was out there to show you some nails or something. And he bent over to get you the nails. What happened?
Jerry, I killed him.
You killed Jeff. And how did you do that?
With a knife. I knew that I couldn't just leave him there with two people who just saw me.
It is cold and calculated, and there's not even pseudo-emotion. Naturally, he's got to go back in and kill a little boy and the other guy he doesn't even know, so no one can identify him. And that's, you know, that's a real big leap. And often the first kills are big leaps. This is where he seems most psychopathic to me.
I go back in, stab Jason. Jesse ran to the back room. So I chased Jesse, and he was the quickest. He just said he was scared. The families don't need to know that.
No, we do. How many times do you think you stabbed him?
Well, I heard on the news 5, so I'm assuming it's 5.
So then you come out to check on Jason, and he's gone.
And yeah, he's gone. He disappeared.
think-
He was out of my
Oh my God.
sight. He ran down the road, and I chased him down the road, and that's why he was in the ditch. He didn't understand, because obviously I had just met him, and there was no reason to him.
You really only met us the very first time.
It was really the first time I met him.
Yeah.
I think there are moments of candor here. It is possible that they can have moments where they are even appalled by their own behavior. Now, how long or how deep or how that moment of recognition really stands with them, that's the question.
Did you do something else besides stab him?
I cut his throat.
You cut his throat? How many times did you cut his throat?
2, maybe 3 slashes. Obviously, this is premeditated murder, is the term you used for it.
Psychopaths tend to use jargon in whatever situation they're in to exemplify their vast knowledge and intelligence. And I find it's the grandiosity within them that sneaks out and wants to use that language and vernacular in whatever context.
Did you go there to planning to kill him?
Yes.
You did? Okay. All right. How long before this were you planning this?
Maybe days.
Have you ever killed before?
No.
Do you feel you did the right thing by killing Jeff?
I feel like the world's a better place without Jeff Riot. You know, best possible outcome. Okay. Honestly. Yep. That good things could grow where evil was destroyed. You might not see it like that, but it's quite possible that these families will now become closer or stronger where they were. That maybe those children might be better growing up without their father.
Psychopaths are most often not remorseful. I think it makes it a little bit difficult for the majority of us to wrap our mind around how he could engage in those actions and basically show no remorse.
You're going to be charged with 3 counts of murder from the state of Maine.
All right.
Could I maybe finish my coffee and cigarette?
No, it's time.
Okay.
Okay. Good luck to you. May God have mercy on your soul.
Okay.
You know, there is no parole in Maine. He will die in prison.
Upon receiving his sentences for stabbing to death Jeffrey Ryan, his 10-year-old son Jesse, and Jason DeHaan, Ormsby did not shed a single tear.
William Bonin's crimes unfolded during a period when Southern California represented freedom, movement, and opportunity. Millions of people traveled its expanding network of freeways every day, believing that the roads connected thriving communities, beaches, suburbs, and cities in a landscape that symbolized the American dream. Families drove between counties without a second thought. Teenagers walked home from school. Hitchhikers stood along busy roads hoping for a ride. And young runaways drifted through neighborhoods searching for a place to belong. Few could have imagined that those same highways would become silent witnesses to one of the most disturbing murder investigations in California's history. Throughout 1979 and into 1980, bodies of teenage boys and young men began appearing near freeway embankments, vacant lots, and isolated roadside locations across Los Angeles County, Orange County, San Bernardino County, and neighboring jurisdictions. Each discovery shocked the local community. But because the victims were found in different counties, investigated by different law enforcement agencies, and often had different personal backgrounds, the crimes initially appeared unrelated. There was no obvious connection, no single crime scene, and no immediate suspect. What investigators could see were individual tragedies. What they could not yet see was the larger pattern forming across Southern California. As more victims were discovered, similarities slowly emerged. Most were teenage boys or young men. Many had disappeared after being seen alone, walking, hitchhiking, or traveling without companions. Many had suffered severe physical assaults before death. Their bodies were abandoned beside highways, leaving investigators to wonder whether the roads themselves somehow played a role in the murders or whether they merely served as convenient places where a killer could disappear into the endless flow of traffic. Newspapers eventually gave this unknown murderer a name that would become infamous throughout the United States: the Freeway Killer. At first, the nickname referred only to an unidentified predator whose victims repeatedly appeared near California's highways. No one knew his identity. No one understood how long he had been killing. Even fewer realized that the violence they were witnessing had not begun suddenly in 1979. Behind the public mystery stood a man whose history of violence stretched back more than a decade. A man whose earlier crimes had already demonstrated an alarming willingness to prey upon vulnerable young people. His name was William George Bonin. Long before his name appeared in newspaper headlines, Bonin's life had been shaped by instability, violence, and repeated encounters with authority. Understanding his background does not explain his crimes, nor does it excuse them. Countless individuals experience difficult childhoods without ever committing acts of violence. Nevertheless, Bonin's early years formed part of the factual history surrounding one of California's most notorious serial murder cases. William George Bonin was born on January 8, 1947, in Willimantic, Connecticut. From the beginning, the environment surrounding his childhood was marked by instability rather than security. According to later psychological records and investigative summaries, his family life was deeply troubled. His father struggled with alcoholism and was frequently violent within the home. Physical abuse became part of everyday life. Rather than finding protection from the adults responsible for his care, Bonin grew up in an environment where fear and unpredictability often replaced affection and stability. His mother was described as emotionally distant and largely uninvolved. At various points, she left the family, contributing further to an already fractured household. As the family continued to struggle, Bonin and his siblings spent time living in children's institutions and foster care. These repeated disruptions meant that consistent parental guidance was largely absent throughout much of his youth. Instead of growing up within a stable family structure, Bonin experienced a childhood divided between abusive homes and institutional settings, where relationships were temporary and permanence was rare. Later psychological evaluations also suggested that Bonin may have experienced abuse beyond the violence already present within his family, although not every allegation could be independently confirmed. Investigators and mental health professionals documented these reports carefully while recognizing that some claims remained unverified. What remained undisputed was that his upbringing exposed him to repeated neglect and violence during his formative years. Reports described frequent physical punishment, including beatings with a belt, and chronic emotional neglect. Such experiences undoubtedly created an environment far removed from the safety expected during childhood. Yet professionals examining his history consistently emphasized an important distinction. Childhood abuse alone does not produce serial killers. The overwhelming majority of abused children never commit violent crimes. Many survive traumatic childhoods and go on to build peaceful lives despite extraordinary adversity. Bonin's background therefore represents one element of his personal history rather than a direct explanation for the horrific choices he would later make. Even during adolescence, signs of troubling behavior reportedly began to emerge. Bonin was described as having a quick temper and displaying aggressive behavior toward individuals he perceived as weaker than himself. At school, he was not remembered for exceptional academic achievement. Instead, accounts characterized him as someone prone to anger and intimidation. While these behaviors alone could never predict future murder, they later became part of a broader pattern examined by investigators attempting to understand his development. As Bonin approached adulthood, the instability of his childhood gave way to another defining chapter of his life. During the mid-1960s, he joined the United States Air Force. Military service offered structure, responsibility, and a sense of purpose that had been largely absent throughout his upbringing. Eventually, he was deployed to Vietnam, where he served as a helicopter gunner and participated in combat operations. According to the available records provided, Bonin was recognized for bravery during his service, receiving commendation after helping rescue fellow servicemen under enemy fire. On the surface, this aspect of his military career appeared entirely different from the life that investigators would later uncover. Those who knew only this chapter might have seen a serviceman who performed courageously under dangerous conditions. Yet the contrast between military commendation and later criminal violence would become one of the unsettling features of his biography. After returning from Vietnam, observers reported significant changes in his personality. He appeared increasingly aggressive and exhibited signs of serious personality disturbances. During or following his military service, allegations also emerged that he had sexually assaulted 2 fellow servicemen. These accusations formed another indication that his violent behavior had begun escalating well before the murders that would eventually bring him national notoriety. The transition from troubled child to decorated serviceman and then to violent offender was neither immediate nor simple. But the warning signs had become increasingly difficult to ignore. By the late 1960s, Bonin's criminal behavior had become impossible to overlook. Rather than seeking victims through random confrontations, he began targeting teenage boys. His methods reflected deliberate selection rather than impulsive violence. He drove through public places where young people gathered, including parks, beaches, shopping centers, and other locations frequented by teenagers. When he encountered boys who appeared alone, he offered rides, presenting himself as an ordinary driver willing to help someone reach home or another destination. For some victims, accepting the offer seemed harmless. Once inside the vehicle, however, they discovered that escape was no longer possible. Several victims survived these early attacks and later reported being beaten and sexually assaulted. After entering his vehicle, in 1969, Bonin was arrested and convicted for kidnapping, rape, and sexual assaults involving underage boys. During the legal proceedings, psychiatrists evaluated him extensively. Their conclusions were strikingly consistent. They described him as an extremely dangerous individual who demonstrated sadistic tendencies and represented a high risk of committing further violent offenses if released. Those assessments would later appear tragically prophetic. Despite these warnings, Bonin eventually completed his sentence and was released after several years of imprisonment and treatment. When he re-entered society, there was no indication to the public that the worst period of violence still lay ahead. For investigators looking back after his eventual arrest, this release marked a devastating turning point. The man whom mental health professionals had identified as highly dangerous returned to Southern California, where, according to the evidence presented years later, he resumed targeting vulnerable young males. What had begun as sexual violence would soon escalate into repeated acts of murder. The highways of Southern California, once symbols of movement and possibility, would become the locations where investigators repeatedly searched for answers. Families desperately searched for missing loved ones, and a killer quietly continued his deadly routine. The pattern had not yet become visible, but the events that would earn William Bonin the name Freeway Killer were already beginning to take shape. After years of incarceration and psychiatric evaluation, William Bonin re-entered society carrying a documented history of violent sexual offenses against teenage boys. His earlier convictions had established a clear pattern of predatory behavior, and the professionals who examined him while he was imprisoned expressed deep concern about the possibility that he would offend again. Their assessments described an individual with sadistic tendencies who presented an exceptionally high risk of future violence. Those warnings would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. They demonstrated that the danger Bonin posed had not gone unnoticed. Even so, after serving his sentence and undergoing treatment, he was eventually released. Life in Southern California continued as usual. Millions of people commuted along crowded freeways each day. Neighborhoods remained filled with students walking to and from school, and countless strangers shared the roads without ever questioning who might be driving in the next lane. Bonin blended effortlessly into that landscape. There was nothing immediately remarkable about the man behind the wheel of his van, and that ordinary appearance became one of his greatest advantages. According to the investigation, Bonin soon resumed the habits that had characterized his earlier crimes. He drove through places where teenagers and young adults regularly gathered, including parks, beaches, shopping centers, and other public locations. Rather than selecting victims at random, he looked for those who appeared isolated. A teenager walking home alone, a hitchhiker hoping to reach another part of the city, a runaway without stable shelter, or a homeless youth moving between neighborhoods all represented individuals who might accept help from a stranger. Bonin exploited that vulnerability. His approach was calm rather than forceful. He would stop beside a young person and offer a ride, presenting himself as nothing more than another motorist willing to help someone reach a destination. During the late 1970s, such encounters were not considered as inherently dangerous as they would become in later years. Many young people accepted rides from strangers without expecting harm. Bonin understood this reality and used it repeatedly. Once a victim entered his vehicle, however, the situation changed almost instantly. Investigators later determined that his preferred vehicle, a Ford Econoline van, functioned as the central tool in his crimes. From the outside, the van looked ordinary enough to disappear into Southern California traffic. Similar vans were common throughout the region, used by tradespeople, delivery services, and families alike. Yet the interior contained items that reflected preparation rather than coincidence. According to evidence later recovered by investigators, the van held rope, handcuffs, tape, blankets, tools, and other equipment capable of restraining victims. Survivors from Bonin's earlier assaults reported that once the vehicle was moving, escape became nearly impossible. The enclosed interior allowed Bonin to isolate his victims from public view while continuing to travel through busy streets and highways without drawing attention. By the spring of 1979, Bonin's crimes escalated from repeated sexual assaults to murder. On May 28, 1979, 13-year-old Thomas Lundgren became the first victim in the series for which Bonin was later convicted. Thomas was walking near Hollywood when he encountered Bonin. Like many boys his age, he was alone, making him especially vulnerable to someone offering transportation. At some point after entering the van, he disappeared. For family members, the disappearance likely began with uncertainty and hope that he would soon return. Instead, 2 days later, Thomas's body was discovered. The medical examination documented severe blunt force trauma to his head, evidence of sexual assault, and death caused by strangulation. At the time, investigators viewed the case as an individual homicide. There was no immediate indication that it marked the beginning of one of California's most extensive serial murder investigations. Yet as months passed, the similarities between Thomas's case and subsequent murders became increasingly difficult to ignore. Bonin continued targeting young males whose circumstances made them vulnerable. Most victims were between 12 and 19 years old. Some were students walking alone after school. Others were hitchhikers attempting to travel between communities. Some had left home voluntarily, while others struggled with homelessness. Their backgrounds differed, but they shared a common vulnerability. They could disappear without immediate witnesses, and they were more likely to trust a stranger offering assistance. Investigators later recognized that Bonin's victim selection reflected deliberate calculation rather than impulse. He sought individuals whose absence might not be reported immediately or whose movements were difficult to trace. Once inside the van, the sequence of violence followed a horrifyingly consistent pattern. Victims were restrained using rope or handcuffs soon after entering the vehicle. Physical assaults followed, often involving repeated blows that caused extensive injuries. Sexual assaults formed a recurring component of the attacks. According to both Bonin's later admissions and the findings of medical examiners, the violence frequently continued for extended periods before death occurred. Some victims died by strangulation, while others suffered fatal stab wounds. Autopsies repeatedly documented severe head injuries, trauma to the genital region, and binding marks consistent with prolonged restraint. One of the most disturbing conclusions reached by forensic pathologists was that several victims remained alive through much of the abuse inflicted upon them. Their injuries indicated that death did not occur immediately after the initial assault, but only after sustained violence. These medical findings became essential evidence linking multiple murders together. While individual cases differed in specific details, the repeated combination of restraint, sexual assault, severe blunt force trauma, and body disposal near highways established a recognizable pattern. After killing his victims, Bonin attempted to distance himself from the crimes by transporting their bodies across county lines. Instead of abandoning victims near the locations where they had been attacked, he drove considerable distances using Southern California's extensive freeway network. Bodies were discovered beside Interstate 5, Interstate 10, Interstate 15, and other major highways serving Los Angeles County, Orange County, San Bernardino County, and neighboring regions. This practice created significant obstacles for investigators. A body discovered beside a freeway in one jurisdiction did not necessarily reveal where the victim had disappeared or where the murder itself had occurred. Each discovery therefore generated a separate investigation handled by the agency responsible for the location where the remains were found. During the early stages of the case, this fragmentation delayed recognition that a single offender was responsible. Detectives in different counties pursued separate leads while unknowingly investigating crimes committed by the same individual. As additional victims were found, however, recurring similarities became impossible to overlook. The victims were almost always young males. Many had been restrained before death. Sexual assault appeared repeatedly. Bodies continued appearing near major highways. Gradually, investigators recognized that these were not isolated murders, but components of an expanding serial homicide investigation. Public concern grew alongside the mounting number of victims. Parents became increasingly fearful about children traveling alone. While communities struggled to understand how someone could continue committing such crimes across Southern California without being identified, newspapers began referring to the unknown offender as the freeway killer, a name inspired by the repeated discovery of bodies beside the region's highways. At that point, the nickname referred only to an unidentified predator. The public knew nothing about his identity, only that he appeared capable of moving between counties while remaining hidden within ordinary traffic. Every new discovery reinforced the urgency of identifying him before more young lives were lost. Yet Bonin's crimes contained another characteristic that would later distinguish his case from many other serial murder investigations. According to detectives, he did not always operate alone. At different points during the investigation, authorities identified 4 individuals who participated alongside him to varying degrees: Vernon Butts, Vernon Dodd, James Monroe, and William Pugh. Their involvement differed from case to case, and investigators did not conclude that every accomplice participated in every murder. Nevertheless, their presence complicated the investigation considerably. Detectives now faced the task of determining not only Bonin's individual actions, but also the specific roles played by those who assisted him. Evidence suggested that Bonin remained the central figure directing the crimes, while accomplices sometimes helped restrain victims, participate in assaults, or dispose of bodies. Among them, Vernon Butts was considered Bonin's closest associate. Before he could stand trial, however, Butts died by suicide while in custody, preventing investigators from obtaining further testimony regarding his involvement. Despite these complications, the steadily increasing number of victims ultimately forced law enforcement agencies to recognize that cooperation across county lines had become essential. Individual investigations were gradually merged into a coordinated effort aimed at identifying the unknown freeway killer. Detectives compared forensic evidence, victim characteristics, methods of restraint, and body disposal locations, assembling what had previously existed only as scattered fragments. The investigation was slowly closing in on the man responsible, even though he remained unaware that the ordinary highways which had concealed his movements for so long would soon become the very network through which investigators traced the pattern that ultimately led to his capture. As investigators across Southern California slowly recognized that the murders shared common characteristics, the challenge before them became increasingly complex. The victims were being discovered in different counties, each with its own investigative procedures, evidence systems, and jurisdictional responsibilities. A body found beside a freeway in one county did not necessarily mean the victim had disappeared there, nor did it reveal where the murder itself had taken place. Every discovery generated its own case file, its own detectives, and its own collection of forensic evidence. Yet beneath those separate investigations, a single pattern continued to emerge. The victims were overwhelmingly teenage boys or young men, generally between the ages of 12 and 19. Many had last been seen alone, walking, hitchhiking, or traveling without companions. Many showed signs of severe physical assault, sexual violence, restraint, and prolonged abuse before death. Their bodies repeatedly appeared near major highways stretching across Los Angeles County, Orange County, San Bernardino County, and neighboring areas. The similarities became too numerous to dismiss as coincidence. Detectives gradually understood that they were not investigating isolated homicides, but pursuing one offender who had learned how to exploit the boundaries separating police jurisdictions. As the number of victims increased during 1979 and into 1980, concern within law enforcement continued to grow. The repeated discoveries demonstrated that the offender remained active and confident. Each successful crime suggested that he believed he could continue operating without being Identified. Unlike offenders who remained close to a single neighborhood, William Bonin used Southern California's freeway network as an extension of his method. The highways allowed him to travel significant distances while blending into ordinary traffic, making it extraordinarily difficult for investigators to determine where individual crimes had actually begun. By transporting victims and abandoning their bodies in different counties, he complicated nearly every aspect of the investigation. Detectives searching for witnesses often found themselves working in locations far removed from where the victim had last been seen alive. Families searching for missing children faced uncertainty that stretched across multiple communities. Every jurisdiction possessed only a fragment of the overall picture. At the center of these crimes remained the Ford Econoline van Bonin drove throughout Southern California. The vehicle appeared ordinary enough to avoid attracting attention. Countless similar vans traveled the region's roads each day, making it nearly impossible for members of the public to distinguish one from another. Yet investigators would later discover that the van contained equipment reflecting careful preparation. Rope, handcuffs, tape, blankets, and various tools were kept inside, providing the means to restrain victims almost immediately after they entered the vehicle. Survivors from Bonin's earlier sexual assaults had already described how quickly an offer of transportation could become captivity. Once the doors closed and the vehicle began moving, opportunities for escape diminished rapidly. According to the evidence presented during the investigation, Bonin followed a remarkably consistent sequence during many of the attacks. He approached young males who appeared vulnerable or isolated. He offered them a ride, presenting himself as an ordinary motorist willing to help. After the victim entered the van, restraints such as rope or handcuffs were used to gain control. Physical violence followed. Victims were beaten repeatedly, sexually assaulted, and subjected to prolonged torture before being killed by strangulation or, in certain cases, stabbing. Medical examinations documented extensive injuries consistent with sustained assaults rather than brief attacks. Investigators found evidence of severe blunt force trauma to the head, injuries resulting from restraints, and significant trauma associated with sexual violence. In several cases, forensic findings indicated that victims remained alive during much of the abuse inflicted upon them. These findings left little doubt regarding the extraordinary cruelty involved in the crimes. They also provided investigators with important similarities that helped connect separate murder investigations into a single series. One feature that distinguished Bonin from many other serial offenders was that he did not always commit his crimes alone. According to the investigation, at least 4 individuals participated alongside him at different times: Vernon Butts, Vernon Dodd, James Monroe, and William Pugh. The evidence did not suggest that every accomplice participated in every murder. Instead, investigators concluded that their involvement varied from case to case, while Bonin remained the central figure directing the violence. This aspect of the investigation added another layer of complexity. Detectives now had to determine not only which murders Bonin had committed personally, but also which involved one or more accomplices. Understanding the specific roles of each participant required careful examination of witness testimony, forensic evidence, and later admissions. Among these individuals, Vernon Butts was regarded as one of Bonin's closest accomplices. Before he could stand trial, however, Butts died by suicide while in custody. His death eliminated the possibility of further courtroom testimony regarding his involvement, leaving investigators to rely on the remaining evidence gathered during the investigation. The existence of accomplices also demonstrated that Bonin's crimes extended beyond isolated acts, committed entirely in secret. At different moments, others became involved in restraining victims, participating in assaults, or helping dispose of bodies. Nevertheless, the available evidence consistently identified Bonin as the dominant participant whose actions shaped the overall pattern of the crimes. As additional victims were discovered, public anxiety intensified. Parents warned children not to accept rides from strangers, communities became increasingly aware that someone was targeting young males across Southern California, yet identifying that individual remained extraordinarily difficult. There were no widespread surveillance systems capable of tracking vehicles across counties, no integrated digital databases instantly linking separate homicide investigations, and no single detective overseeing every related case from the beginning. Information traveled more slowly, often requiring investigators from different agencies to compare reports manually. The limitations of communication between jurisdictions became one of the defining challenges of the investigation. Eventually, the growing number of similar murders prompted the formation of a dedicated task force. Investigators recognized that the crimes could no longer be approached as independent homicides. Instead, they required coordinated cooperation between agencies responsible for different counties. Detectives began comparing forensic reports, victim characteristics, and methods used by the unknown offender. Similarities that had once appeared incidental gradually became central to the investigation. Victim age, gender, injury patterns, methods of restraint, and body disposal locations all pointed toward a single offender operating across Southern California. While investigators worked to assemble these pieces, the breakthrough that would eventually expose Bonin developed from an unexpected direction. William Pugh, one of the individuals later identified as an accomplice in some of the crimes, was arrested in connection with an unrelated vehicle theft. During the course of that arrest, he provided information that directed investigators toward William Bonin. Although detectives had already begun recognizing the larger pattern connecting the murders, Pugh's statements significantly narrowed their focus. Rather than searching for an entirely unknown suspect, investigators now had a specific individual whose background and behavior warranted close examination. Acting on this information, law enforcement initiated surveillance of Bonin. Rather than making an immediate arrest, investigators sought additional evidence capable of linking him directly to the murders. Surveillance allowed detectives to observe his movements while preserving the opportunity to intervene if another crime occurred. It was a critical stage of the investigation because prosecutors would ultimately require substantial physical evidence rather than suspicion alone. Every decision made during this period carried enormous consequences. Acting too soon risked losing the opportunity to establish stronger connections between Bonin and multiple murders. Waiting too long risked allowing additional victims to be harmed. Investigators therefore faced the difficult balance between gathering evidence and preventing further violence. That balance would soon be tested. On June 11, 1980, surveillance efforts reached their decisive moment. Investigators stopped Bonin's van while he was transporting a 15-year-old boy. The teenager was found alive, providing officers with immediate confirmation that intervention had occurred before another homicide could be completed. The significance of that moment cannot be overstated. After months of searching for an unidentified serial killer responsible for numerous murders across Southern California, detectives finally had both the primary suspect and a living victim connected to the same vehicle. A subsequent search of the van revealed items that investigators immediately recognized as highly significant: rope, handcuffs, blood-stained clothing, and additional evidence connected the vehicle to the methods repeatedly documented throughout the murder investigation. What had previously existed as scattered forensic patterns across multiple counties now converged around a single suspect. The highways that had once concealed Bonin's movements no longer offered protection. The extensive investigation that had begun with isolated discoveries besides Southern California's freeways had reached the point where investigators finally possessed the evidence needed to place William Bonin under arrest. The unidentified freeway killer now had a name, and the next stage of the case would move from searching for the offender to proving in court the full extent of his crimes. By the beginning of 1980, the growing number of murdered teenage boys and young men discovered across Southern California could no longer be dismissed as a series of unrelated tragedies. Investigators from multiple jurisdictions had begun comparing reports, forensic findings, and victim profiles, gradually recognizing that the similarities extended far beyond coincidence. The victims were overwhelmingly male, generally between the ages of 12 and 19. Many had disappeared after traveling alone, whether walking, hitchhiking, or moving between communities. Medical examinations repeatedly documented severe blunt force trauma, evidence of sexual assault, injuries caused by restraints, and deaths most commonly resulting from strangulation. Their bodies continued to appear beside major highways that cross Los Angeles County, Orange County, San Bernardino County, and neighboring areas. Although each homicide had initially been investigated separately, detectives now understood that they were pursuing a single offender whose mobility allowed him to exploit the boundaries between counties. Recognizing the scope of the threat, law enforcement established a task force to improve cooperation between agencies. Instead of treating every homicide as an isolated investigation, detectives began pooling information in an effort to identify recurring patterns. Victim characteristics, methods of attack, forensic evidence, and body disposal locations were carefully compared. This coordinated approach represented an important shift in strategy. Until then, the killer had benefited from fragmented investigations, with different departments working independently. Now those fragments were slowly being assembled into one increasingly detailed picture. Investigators still did not know the identity of the man they were searching for, but they understood far more about the offender's behavior. They knew he targeted vulnerable teenage boys and young men. They knew he relied on transportation to isolate victims. They knew he disposed of bodies beside freeways after traveling significant distances. Most importantly, they realized the murders reflected a consistent pattern rather than random acts of violence. While detectives worked to strengthen connections between the murders, an unexpected development provided the first significant breakthrough. William Pugh, who had been associated with William Bonin during some criminal activities, was arrested in connection with an unrelated vehicle theft. During questioning, Pugh supplied information that drew investigators' attention toward Bonin. Until that point, detectives had been searching broadly for an unidentified serial offender. Pugh's statements narrowed the investigation dramatically by identifying a specific individual whose background and behavior warranted close scrutiny. Bonin's previous convictions for kidnapping and sexually assaulting teenage boys immediately made him a person of considerable interest. His documented history aligned with many of the behavioral characteristics investigators had already identified in the unknown freeway killer. Rather than moving directly to an arrest, investigators chose a more cautious approach. They initiated surveillance of Bonin, hoping to gather stronger evidence capable of linking him directly to the ongoing murders. This decision reflected both legal necessity and investigative strategy. Suspicion alone would not be sufficient to secure convictions for multiple homicides. Detectives needed physical evidence corroborating testimony or direct observation connecting Bonin to criminal activity. Surveillance also allowed officers to intervene quickly if they observed behavior placing another potential victim at risk. Every day of observation required careful judgment. Acting too early might prevent investigators from collecting the evidence necessary to prove the full extent of Bonin's crimes. Waiting too long carried the unacceptable risk that additional victims might be harmed. As officers followed Bonin's movements, they watched a man who outwardly appeared unremarkable. He drove through Southern California in his Ford Econoline van, blending into the constant stream of traffic flowing between cities and counties. To other motorists, he was simply another driver navigating familiar roads. Investigators, however, viewed every movement differently. They understood that if their suspicions were correct, this ordinary-looking vehicle had become the center of one of the largest serial murder investigations in California's history. The surveillance reached its decisive moment on June 11, 1980. Acting on the information they had gathered, investigators stopped Bonin while he was transporting a 15-year-old boy in the van. The significance of that encounter was immediate. The teenager was alive, allowing officers to intervene before another murder could be completed. For detectives who had spent months investigating bodies discovered beside highways, finding a living victim represented a critical turning point. It transformed the investigation from reconstructing past crimes to interrupting one that was actively unfolding. Officers quickly secured the scene and began examining the vehicle. Inside the van, they discovered items that closely matched the methods repeatedly documented. Throughout the investigation, rope, handcuffs, blood-stained clothing, and other evidence were recovered during the search. These objects corresponded directly with the recurring patterns observed during autopsies and previous investigations involving victims who had been restrained, assaulted, and murdered. The significance of the evidence extended beyond the individual traffic stop. For months, detectives had been attempting to connect separate homicides occurring across multiple counties. Now they possessed a vehicle containing physical evidence consistent with those crimes, along with a suspect whose criminal history already demonstrated a pattern of targeting teenage boys. Bonin was arrested, and investigators immediately began the complex process of comparing the evidence recovered from the van with material collected throughout the murder investigations. The arrest marked the end of the freeway killer's ability to continue operating, but it also marked the beginning of an equally demanding phase of the case. Detectives now faced the enormous task of proving Bonin's responsibility for multiple murders, committed over more than a year. Physical evidence recovered during the arrest would become only one part of a much larger investigative effort. Following his arrest, Bonin admitted responsibility for 21 murders. According to his statements, several of the crimes involved accomplices, and he described the methods he used to select victims. His admissions provided investigators with valuable information, but prosecutors remained cautious. A confession alone would not automatically guarantee convictions, particularly in cases involving numerous victims spread across different jurisdictions. Instead, prosecutors focused on building cases supported by independent evidence. Physical evidence, forensic findings, witness testimony, statements from accomplices, and surviving victims of Bonin's earlier sexual assaults all became essential components of the prosecution strategy. Investigators understood that each murder required careful documentation capable of withstanding intense scrutiny in court. The existence of accomplices added further complexity. Authorities had already identified Vernon Butts, Vernon Dodd, James Monroe, and William Pugh as individuals who participated in different crimes to varying degrees. Investigators emphasized that not every accomplice took part in every murder and that their levels of involvement differed considerably. Bonin nevertheless remained the central figure directing the violence. Among the identified accomplices, Vernon Butts was believed to have been Bonin's closest associate. Before his trial could begin, however, Butts died by suicide while in custody, preventing prosecutors from presenting his testimony before a jury. His death underscored the complicated nature of the investigation, in which several participants possessed knowledge about crimes extending across multiple counties and involving numerous victims. As detectives continued reviewing evidence, they also recognized that the Bonin investigation exposed significant weaknesses in communication between law enforcement agencies. Before the task force had been established, separate jurisdictions possessed only portions of the overall picture. Bodies discovered in different counties had generated independent investigations that were not immediately connected. Bonin's practice of transporting victims across county lines deliberately complicated efforts to identify the pattern. Only through sustained cooperation, comparison of forensic evidence, and information sharing had investigators finally recognized that the murders formed a single series. This realization would later influence changes in investigative practices throughout California, encouraging greater coordination between agencies handling similar crimes. Although Bonin's arrest effectively ended the series of murders attributed to the freeway killer, it did not end the search for justice. Families who had spent months or years mourning missing sons now faced lengthy legal proceedings that would revisit the circumstances of each crime in painstaking detail. Detectives who had worked separate homicide investigations prepared to combine their evidence into prosecutions capable of demonstrating the full extent of Bonin's actions. Prosecutors faced the challenge of presenting multiple murders committed across different jurisdictions while ensuring that each charge rested upon reliable forensic evidence and credible testimony rather than solely upon Bonin's own admissions. The investigation that had begun with isolated bodies discovered beside Southern California highways had finally identified the man responsible. The next phase would move into courtrooms, where evidence collected over months of painstaking detective work would be examined before judges and juries tasked with determining William Bonin's criminal responsibility and deciding the punishment for one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in California history. William Bonin's arrest on June 11, 1980, marked the end of the murders attributed to the freeway killer, but for investigators it represented the beginning of an equally demanding challenge. The months spent searching for an unknown offender had now given way to the painstaking task of proving his responsibility in court. Unlike a single homicide investigation, the Bonin case involved numerous victims, multiple jurisdictions, different crime scenes, and several individuals who had participated in various stages of the crimes. Every piece of evidence had to be carefully organized, verified, and connected to specific charges. Detectives who had previously worked independently suddenly found themselves collaborating on one of the largest serial murder prosecutions California had seen. The investigation no longer centered on identifying the killer. Instead, it focused on ensuring that every provable crime could withstand intense legal scrutiny. Following Bonin's arrest, investigators conducted an extensive examination of the evidence recovered from his Ford Econoline van. The vehicle had already become central to the investigation because it matched the methods detectives had reconstructed while studying the murders. Inside, officers found rope, handcuffs, bloodstained clothing, and other items consistent with the repeated pattern of restraint and violence documented throughout the homicide series. These discoveries reinforced what investigators had gradually concluded while comparing cases across Southern California. The van was no longer merely a means of transportation. According to the evidence presented during the investigation, it had functioned as the place where victims were restrained and assaulted before being transported to locations where their bodies would later be abandoned beside major highways. The recovery of these items significantly strengthened the prosecution's ability to connect Bonin to multiple crimes using physical evidence rather than relying solely on witness statements or confessions. One of the most significant developments after the arrest was Bonin's own decision to speak with investigators. According to the information provided in the case record, he admitted responsibility for 21 murders. He also acknowledged that several of the crimes involved accomplices and described the process he used when selecting victims. These admissions offered investigators valuable insight into the overall scope of his crimes. However, prosecutors understood that confessions alone rarely determine the outcome of complex homicide trials. Statements made after arrest must be supported by independent evidence whenever possible. For that reason, investigators treated Bonin's admissions not as the conclusion of the investigation, but as additional information to be compared against existing forensic findings, witness testimony, and physical evidence. Every statement had to be verified before it could become part of the prosecution's case. This careful approach reflected the seriousness of the charges. Prosecutors intended to seek convictions only where the available evidence independently established Bonin's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Although Bonin admitted to 21 murders, authorities ultimately chose to prosecute only those cases supported by sufficient forensic evidence and corroborating testimony. This decision demonstrated the prosecution's commitment to building legally sustainable cases rather than relying exclusively on Bonin's own words. The investigation therefore continued even after his confession. As detectives compared crime scene evidence, medical examinations, and witness accounts with the details Bonin had provided. Each confirmed connection strengthened the legal foundation of the upcoming trials. Another important aspect of the investigation involved the individuals identified as Bonin's accomplices. Authorities determined that at least 4 men had participated alongside him at different times: Vernon Butts, Vernon Dodd, James Monroe, and William Pugh. Investigators emphasized throughout the proceedings that these men did not all participate in every murder. Their involvement varied considerably depending on the individual crime. Bonin nevertheless remained the central figure directing the violence. Understanding the specific responsibilities of each accomplice required extensive interviews, examination of evidence, and comparison of statements. Detectives sought to determine who had participated in restraining victims, who had assisted in assaults, and who had helped transport or abandon bodies after the murders. These distinctions became essential because criminal responsibility differed according to each person's actions and level of participation. Vernon Butts occupied a particularly significant position within the investigation because he was considered Bonin's closest accomplice. According to investigators, Butts participated in several crimes alongside Bonin. However, before he could face trial, Butts died by suicide while in custody. His death prevented prosecutors from questioning him in court or obtaining further testimony that might have clarified aspects of the investigation. Although investigators continued building their cases using other available evidence, Butts' suicide removed one potential source of first-hand information regarding Bonin's activities. Meanwhile, Vernon Dodd, James Monroe, and William Pugh remained important figures as investigators worked to understand the varying degrees of their involvement. William Pugh's earlier statements had already played a crucial role by directing law enforcement toward Bonin, ultimately contributing to the surveillance operation that ended with Bonin's arrest. Throughout this stage of the investigation, detectives relied heavily on forensic evidence collected from numerous crime scenes. Medical examinations had consistently documented patterns of blunt force trauma, sexual assault, restraint injuries, and deaths caused primarily by strangulation. Those recurring characteristics now became invaluable in demonstrating that apparently separate murders shared a common method. Fingerprints, fiber evidence, and other forensic findings were assembled alongside physical evidence recovered from Bonin's vehicle. Prosecutors also prepared testimony from surviving victims of Bonin's earlier sexual assaults. Although those attacks had occurred before the murder series, the survivors' experiences illustrated a consistent pattern in Bonin's methods. Their accounts demonstrated how he approached vulnerable teenage boys, persuaded them to enter his vehicle, and quickly transformed an ordinary offer of transportation into violent captivity. These earlier crimes established behavioral continuity that investigators believed was highly relevant to understanding the later murders. As prosecutors organized the evidence, they faced another challenge created by the geographical scope of the crimes. Because victims had been abducted, assaulted, murdered, and abandoned across multiple counties, Bonin did not face a single trial. Instead, legal proceedings occurred in different jurisdictions responsible for the individual murders committed within their authority. This required close cooperation between prosecutors from Los Angeles County, Orange County, and other agencies involved in the investigation. Evidence gathered by detectives working in one county frequently proved relevant to cases prosecuted elsewhere. The same pattern of cooperation that had become essential during the investigation remained equally important throughout the judicial process. The courtroom presentations emphasized that Bonin's crimes followed a recognizable sequence. Prosecutors demonstrated how he selected vulnerable teenage boys and young men, offered them rides in his van, restrained them using rope or handcuffs, subjected them to severe physical and sexual assaults, and ultimately killed them before abandoning their bodies beside Southern California highways. The consistency of these methods, supported by forensic evidence and witness testimony, reinforced the argument that the murders formed part of a single continuing course of conduct rather than isolated acts committed under unrelated circumstances. After hearing the evidence presented across the various proceedings, juries found William Bonin guilty of 14 counts of first-degree murder. In addition to the murder convictions, he was found guilty of multiple offenses involving kidnapping, robbery, and sexual assault. These verdicts reflected not only the evidence connecting him to individual victims, but also the broader investigation that had painstakingly linked numerous crimes committed across different counties. The sentences imposed were equally severe. Bonin received multiple death sentences in both Los Angeles County and Orange County, ensuring that the legal system recognized the extraordinary gravity of his crimes. For the families of the victims, the verdicts represented an important milestone, though they could never erase the devastating losses they had endured. The lengthy investigations, repeated court appearances, and detailed presentation of evidence required them to revisit painful memories as each case moved through the justice system. While convictions provided legal accountability, they could not restore the lives that had been taken. For detectives and prosecutors, however, the successful prosecutions demonstrated the value of persistence, forensic analysis, and cooperation between jurisdictions. A series of murders that had once appeared disconnected because of county boundaries had ultimately been reconstructed into one comprehensive case. The judicial proceedings against William Bonin became the final demonstration that coordinated investigative work could overcome even the deliberate efforts of a serial killer who had attempted to hide his crimes by using Southern California's vast freeway system as both his hunting ground and his means of concealment. The legal process established responsibility for the murders proven in court, but the impact of the case would continue long after the verdicts were delivered, influencing investigative practices throughout California and leaving a lasting reminder of the importance of communication between law enforcement agencies when confronting crimes that extend beyond a single jurisdiction. Following William Bonin's convictions and the imposition of multiple death sentences, the legal proceedings that had dominated Southern California for years gradually came to an end. The investigation had successfully identified the man responsible for the murders proven in court, and prosecutors had secured convictions supported by forensic evidence, witness testimony, physical evidence recovered during the investigation, and corroborated admissions. Yet for the families of the victims, the conclusion of the trials did not represent an end to their loss. Courtroom verdicts can establish legal responsibility, but they cannot restore the lives that were taken or erase the years of grief experienced by parents, siblings, relatives, and friends. Throughout the proceedings, each victim's story had been revisited through testimony, medical evidence, and investigative reports. Every case reminded those present that behind the statistics stood individual young lives, interrupted by extraordinary violence. The legal process acknowledged those losses, but it could never fully answer the emotional questions left behind. After receiving multiple death sentences in Los Angeles County and Orange County, Bonin remained on California's death row for many years while the legal process continued. Capital cases in the United States typically involve extensive appellate review, and Bonin's case followed that path. Nearly 16 years passed between his sentencing and the execution of his sentence. During that period, the convictions obtained during the various trials remained the foundation upon which the state maintained its judgment. Eventually, on February 23, 1996, William Bonin was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. According to witnesses present at the execution, he did not offer a final confession concerning additional crimes, nor did he express remorse toward the victims whose lives had been taken. His execution marked the legal conclusion of one of California's most notorious serial murder cases. Bonin also became one of the first prisoners executed by lethal injection after California resumed carrying out capital punishment using that method. While the execution concluded the state's criminal proceedings against him, it did not bring complete closure to every aspect of the investigation. Bonin had admitted responsibility for 21 murders, while investigators suspected that the total number of victims might have reached somewhere between 22 and 36, or possibly more. However, prosecutors deliberately limited the criminal charges to those murders supported by sufficient forensic evidence and corroborating testimony. This distinction remains important when examining the historical record. The convictions established Bonin's legal responsibility for 14 murders beyond a reasonable doubt, while his admissions and investigators' suspicions suggested that the overall scope of his violence may have been even greater. The uncertainty surrounding the exact number of victims continues to distinguish the case from many other serial murder investigations. Some questions remained unresolved because not every disappearance could be conclusively linked through the available evidence. Investigators therefore continued to distinguish carefully between proven convictions, admitted crimes, and suspected victims. One of the lasting consequences of the Bonin investigation involved the role played by his accomplices. Throughout the inquiry, authorities identified Vernon Butts, Vernon Dodd, James Monroe, and William Pugh as individuals who had participated alongside Bonin to varying degrees. Their involvement differed depending on the individual crime, and investigators consistently emphasized that not every accomplice participated in every murder. Bonin nevertheless remained the dominant figure directing the overall pattern of violence. The investigation into these accomplices reinforced another important lesson for law enforcement. Serial murder cases may not always involve a single offender acting entirely alone. Detectives learned that understanding relationships between offenders could prove essential when reconstructing complicated criminal events. William Pugh's information had helped direct investigators toward Bonin, while the evidence concerning the other accomplices assisted prosecutors in developing a clearer understanding of how different crimes had unfolded. Although Vernon Butts died by suicide before trial, preventing further testimony, the investigation nevertheless documented his role through other available evidence. Beyond the courtroom, the Bonin case produced significant changes in the way California law enforcement agencies approached investigations spanning multiple jurisdictions. Before detectives recognized that the murders were connected, individual police departments had investigated bodies discovered within their own counties without immediately recognizing the broader pattern. Bonin's practice of transporting victims across county lines had exploited this lack of coordination. Bodies abandoned beside highways in different jurisdictions generated separate investigations, delaying recognition that a single offender was responsible. Once investigators established a coordinated task force and began sharing information systematically, the similarities became increasingly obvious. Victim characteristics, methods of restraint, forensic findings, and body disposal locations all pointed toward the same offender. The success of that collaborative approach demonstrated the necessity of stronger communication between agencies handling serious violent crimes. As a result, the Bonin investigation became one of the cases frequently associated with improvements in interagency cooperation throughout California. Another lasting influence involved the growing importance of behavioral analysis in criminal investigations. Throughout the Bonin case, detectives gradually recognized that recurring patterns of victim selection, methods of attack, and body disposal could reveal valuable information about an unknown offender long before his identity became known. Investigators observed that Bonin consistently targeted vulnerable teenage boys and young men, frequently approached individuals who were alone, relied upon transportation to isolate victims, restrained them using similar methods, and repeatedly abandoned bodies beside major highways. Examining these behavioral similarities helped investigators understand that apparently unrelated murders formed part of a single continuing series. The development and application of criminal profiling received greater attention partly because cases such as Bonin's demonstrated the practical value of identifying consistent behavioral patterns across multiple crime scenes. While profiling alone could never identify a specific offender, it provided investigators with an additional framework for organizing evidence and recognizing connections that might otherwise remain hidden. The Bonin investigation also served as a reminder of the importance of listening carefully to professional assessments concerning dangerous offenders. Years before the murders began, psychiatrists evaluating Bonin had already described him as an individual presenting a high risk of future violent behavior. Those evaluations did not predict the exact crimes that would later occur, nor could they establish certainty regarding future actions. Nevertheless, the warnings documented during his earlier imprisonment became a significant part of the historical discussion surrounding the case. They highlighted the difficult questions faced by criminal justice systems when balancing rehabilitation, public safety, and decisions regarding release. At the same time, investigators and mental health professionals consistently cautioned against drawing simplistic conclusions from Bonin's childhood. His upbringing unquestionably involved instability, neglect, and violence. Yet experts repeatedly emphasize that such experiences do not inevitably produce serial killers. Countless individuals endure severe childhood trauma without committing violent crimes. Bonin remained responsible for the decisions he made throughout adulthood, and his personal history could never excuse or justify the suffering inflicted upon his victims. Remembering that distinction remains essential when discussing cases involving offenders with troubled backgrounds. Perhaps the most enduring lesson left by the freeway killer case concerns the victims themselves. Public attention often focuses on notorious offenders because of the scale of their crimes. Yet the true human story belongs to the young lives that were lost and the families forever changed by those disappearances. The investigation repeatedly described victims who were students, hitchhikers, runaways, or homeless youths, many of whom simply happened to be alone at the wrong moment when Bonin crossed their path. Their vulnerability did not diminish their value. Each represented an individual with a future interrupted by violence. Throughout the lengthy investigation and subsequent trials, detectives, prosecutors, forensic specialists, and family members worked to ensure that those victims were remembered as more than anonymous statistics connected to a famous criminal case. The legal system ultimately held William Bonin accountable for the murders proven through evidence, while the broader investigation transformed investigative practices that continue to influence law enforcement cooperation today. The highways that once concealed his movements ultimately became the very threads investigators followed to reveal the pattern of his crimes. In that sense, the case stands not only as a record of extraordinary violence, but also as an example of determined investigative work overcoming jurisdictional barriers through patience, collaboration, and careful examination of evidence. The legacy of the freeway killer investigation therefore extends beyond the courtroom, reminding future investigators that even the most complex serial crimes can be unraveled when agencies share information. Follow the evidence wherever it leads, and keep the focus on securing justice for victims rather than allowing geography or administrative boundaries to obscure the truth. When historians, criminologists, and retired investigators look back on the William Bonin case today, they often describe it as a turning point in the way serial homicide investigations were conducted in California. Yet that conclusion did not emerge because the crimes were unique in every respect. Rather, it came from the combination of factors that made the investigation exceptionally difficult. Bonin did not remain confined to a single neighborhood or even a single county. He exploited one of Southern California's defining characteristics: an enormous network of freeways connecting dozens of cities and jurisdictions. Every time he transported a victim across county lines before abandoning a body, he created another obstacle for detectives attempting to reconstruct what had happened. In the early stages of the investigation, each county naturally focused on crimes discovered within its own jurisdiction. Missing persons reports originated in one location, bodies appeared in another, and potential evidence was scattered across multiple agencies. Individually, each investigation made sense. Collectively, however, they represented pieces of a puzzle that no single detective initially possessed. The Bonin case demonstrated with painful clarity that violent offenders could exploit administrative boundaries just as effectively as physical distance. One of the most important lessons emerging from the investigation involved communication. Once detectives from different jurisdictions began sharing information systematically, patterns that had previously seemed isolated became unmistakable. Victim profiles aligned closely. Most were teenage boys or young men between the ages of 12 and 19. Their injuries displayed remarkable similarities, including evidence of restraint, severe physical assault, sexual violence, and deaths most commonly caused by strangulation. Bodies repeatedly appeared beside major highways after being transported considerable distances from where victims had last been seen. Each similarity strengthened the conclusion that investigators were pursuing one offender rather than multiple unrelated killers. The creation of a coordinated task force represented a decisive change in investigative strategy. Instead of allowing county boundaries to divide information, law enforcement agencies began comparing forensic findings, witness statements, victim histories, and crime scene evidence. This cooperative approach eventually helped identify William Bonin as the man behind the crimes. The investigation, therefore, became an influential example of why communication between agencies remains essential whenever violent crimes extend beyond a single jurisdiction. Another enduring aspect of the case concerns the evolution of behavioral analysis during criminal investigations. Detectives did not identify Bonin through profiling alone, nor did behavioral analysis replace traditional investigative work. Instead, the recurring characteristics of the murders provided an organizational framework that helped investigators recognize connections among seemingly separate crimes. They observed that the offender consistently selected vulnerable young males, frequently approached individuals traveling alone, relied upon a vehicle to isolate victims, restrained them with similar methods, sexually assaulted them, inflicted prolonged physical violence, and abandoned their bodies beside freeways. These recurring behaviors allowed investigators to compare cases more effectively, reinforcing the conclusion that they were confronting a serial offender operating across Southern California. Cases such as Bonin's encouraged greater appreciation for the role behavioral patterns could play alongside forensic science, witness testimony, and physical evidence. They illustrated that understanding how an offender repeatedly commits crimes can become as important as understanding where individual crimes occurred. The Bonin investigation also highlighted the importance of preserving and comparing forensic evidence across multiple cases. Throughout the prosecution, authorities relied not only on Bonin's admissions, but also on fingerprints, fiber evidence, forensic examinations, physical evidence recovered from his van, statements from accomplices, and testimony from survivors of his earlier sexual assaults. Prosecutors deliberately chose to pursue only those murders supported by sufficient corroborating evidence. This approach reflected a broader principle within criminal justice. Confessions alone are rarely considered enough in complex homicide cases. Independent evidence strengthens reliability, protects the integrity of prosecutions, and helps ensure that convictions withstand appellate review. The careful construction of the Bonin cases demonstrated the value of patience and meticulous documentation even after investigators believed they had identified the correct suspect. Another important discussion generated by the case involves the role of mental health evaluations in assessing dangerous offenders. Before the murder series began, psychiatrists had already described Bonin as presenting an exceptionally high risk of future violence following his convictions for kidnapping and sexually assaulting teenage boys. Those documented evaluations later became a significant topic of discussion because they demonstrated that professionals had recognized the seriousness of his behavior long before the murders occurred. At the same time, the Bonin case also serves as an important reminder about the limits of prediction. Mental health professionals can assess risk based on documented behavior and clinical evaluation, but they cannot predict future crimes with absolute certainty. Their assessments contribute to decision-making. They do not determine outcomes by themselves. The historical significance of those evaluations, therefore, lies not in suggesting certainty, but in illustrating how seriously Bonin's earlier behavior had already been regarded. Discussions surrounding Bonin's childhood continue to generate similar caution. The available information describes an upbringing marked by violence, instability, neglect, frequent movement between caregivers, and possible abuse. Such experiences undoubtedly shaped many aspects of his early development. Nevertheless, psychologists examining the case consistently emphasize that traumatic childhood experiences do not inevitably produce serial killers. Most individuals who experience abuse or neglect never commit violent crimes. Presenting Bonin's childhood as an explanation for his actions would ignore that essential reality. His personal history may provide context for understanding aspects of his development, but it cannot excuse the deliberate decisions he made throughout adulthood. Maintaining that distinction remains important whenever society examines offenders with difficult backgrounds. Responsibility for Bonin's crimes ultimately rested with Bonin himself. Equally important is remembering that the central story of this case belongs not to the offender, but to the victims. Historical accounts often focus heavily on notorious criminals because their actions generate widespread attention. Yet behind every statistic cited during the investigation stood a young person whose future was permanently taken away. The victims included students, hitchhikers, runaways, and homeless youths. Some disappeared while walking alone. Others simply accepted what appeared to be an ordinary offer of transportation. None could reasonably have anticipated the violence that awaited them inside Bonin's van. Their families endured not only the initial disappearances, but also the uncertainty that accompanied. Investigations stretching across multiple counties before connections between the murders became clear. Court proceedings required many relatives to revisit painful details repeatedly as prosecutors presented evidence concerning the circumstances of each death. Although the legal system eventually secured convictions and multiple death sentences, those verdicts could never restore the lives that had been lost. The emotional consequences extended far beyond the courtroom and continued long after Bonin's execution in 1996. Looking back, one of the defining features of the freeway killer investigation is how ordinary circumstances became central to extraordinary crimes. Bonin did not rely on elaborate disguises or sophisticated technology. He drove an ordinary van through ordinary neighborhoods, offering rides that initially appeared harmless. The same highways used daily by millions of commuters became the routes along which victims disappeared and where investigators later discovered their bodies. The familiarity of those surroundings made the crimes especially unsettling. They demonstrated how routine aspects of everyday life could be manipulated by someone determined to exploit trust and vulnerability. At the same time, those very highways eventually helped investigators recognize the repeated disposal pattern that connected the murders into one investigation. What Bonin viewed as a strategy for concealing his crimes ultimately became one of the recurring characteristics that united the evidence against him. The William Bonin case therefore remains significant for several interconnected reasons. It revealed the importance of cooperation between jurisdictions when investigating crimes that cross administrative boundaries. It demonstrated the value of combining behavioral analysis with traditional forensic investigation. It reinforced the necessity of corroborating confessions through independent evidence. It encouraged closer attention to communication between law enforcement agencies responsible for neighboring communities. Most importantly, it underscored the obligation to keep victims at the center of every investigation. Behind every forensic report, courtroom exhibit, and investigative file stood real families searching for answers and justice. Their perseverance, together with the sustained efforts of detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and countless investigators working across multiple counties, ultimately ensured that William Bonin was identified, prosecuted, convicted, and held legally accountable for the murders proven against him. More than 4 decades after the crimes began, the freeway killer case continues to be studied not because of any fascination with the offender himself, but because it illustrates both the devastating human cost of serial violence and the enduring importance of determined, coordinated investigative work in the pursuit of justice. Nearly half a century has passed since the murders that came to define the William Bonin investigation. Yet the case continues to occupy an important place in the history of American criminal investigations. It is remembered not only because of the number of victims attributed to the offender, but because it exposed weaknesses in investigative coordination that were gradually corrected through determined cooperation between multiple law enforcement agencies. More importantly, it remains a reminder that behind every famous criminal case are families whose lives were permanently altered long after headlines disappeared. As public attention inevitably shifted elsewhere, parents, siblings, relatives, and friends continued living with the absence created by each victim's death. For them, the conclusion of the investigation was never the conclusion of the story. It simply marked the point at which uncertainty gave way to grief that would remain for decades. The victims targeted by Bonin shared certain characteristics that investigators recognized only. After comparing numerous cases, most were teenage boys or young men between the ages of 12 and 19. Some were students returning home. Others were hitchhikers, runaways, or homeless youths moving through Southern California's vast urban landscape. They came from different neighborhoods and different personal circumstances, yet they all encountered someone who appeared outwardly ordinary. Bonin did not rely upon dramatic confrontations or elaborate deception beyond offering transportation. He exploited everyday trust. During the late 1970s, accepting a ride from a stranger was still common enough that many young people saw little reason to question it. That social reality became an important element in the investigation because it explained how victims could disappear without obvious signs of struggle in public places. Looking back today, it is easy to judge those decisions through the lens of modern awareness. But investigators repeatedly emphasized that the circumstances of the time were different. Responsibility rested entirely with the offender who deliberately manipulated ordinary human trust for violent purposes. One reason the investigation remains significant is the deliberate restraint shown by prosecutors and investigators when presenting the case. Bonin admitted responsibility for 21 murders, while investigators suspected that the total number of victims could have reached somewhere between 22 and 36 or even more. Nevertheless, prosecutors pursued convictions only in those cases supported by sufficient forensic evidence, corroborating testimony, and physical evidence. This distinction reflects an essential principle within the criminal justice system. Investigations must be guided by verifiable evidence rather than assumptions, regardless of how notorious the suspect becomes. By limiting charges to provable crimes, prosecutors strengthened the integrity of the legal process while ensuring that convictions rested upon independently supported facts rather than reputation or speculation. That careful approach remains one of the enduring strengths of the Bonin prosecution. The investigation also demonstrated the remarkable importance of forensic science. Throughout the various homicide cases, medical examiners documented recurring patterns involving restraint injuries, blunt force trauma, sexual assault, and deaths caused primarily by strangulation. Individually, these findings explain the circumstances surrounding each victim's death. Collectively, they revealed the consistent methods of a single offender. Physical evidence recovered during Bonin's arrest, including rope, handcuffs, blood-stained clothing, and other materials found inside the Ford Econoline van, further strengthened those connections. Fingerprints, fiber evidence, witness testimony, and statements from surviving victims of Bonin's earlier sexual assaults all contributed to building a comprehensive evidentiary record. The successful prosecution ultimately reflected not one dramatic discovery, but the accumulation of countless carefully documented facts gathered by investigators over many months. The case further highlighted how criminal investigations evolve alongside changes in technology and organizational practice. During the period when Bonin committed his crimes, law enforcement agencies often maintained separate investigative systems with limited mechanisms for rapidly sharing information across jurisdictions. Detectives relied heavily on telephone calls, written reports, and personal communication between departments. Today, many of those limitations have been reduced through improved databases, digital record systems, and more structured cooperation between agencies. Although no investigative system can eliminate violent crime entirely, the lessons learned from cases such as Bonin's helped encourage improvements designed to identify patterns more quickly when offenders operate across multiple jurisdictions. The investigation, therefore, occupies an important place in discussions about the continuing development of modern homicide investigations. Equally significant was the increased attention given to behavioral analysis. Bonin's crimes displayed remarkable consistency in victim selection, methods of control, and body disposal. Detectives gradually recognized that these recurring behaviors could assist in connecting otherwise separate investigations. Criminal profiling did not solve the case independently, nor was it presented as a substitute for physical evidence. Instead, behavioral observations complemented forensic science by helping investigators organize information and recognize recurring patterns. Understanding that the same offender consistently targeted vulnerable young males, relied upon transportation, restrained victims using similar methods, and abandoned bodies beside freeways enabled detectives to see relationships that might otherwise have remained hidden. Cases like Bonin's demonstrated that behavior itself can become an important form of evidence when interpreted carefully alongside traditional investigative techniques. Another aspect of the case that continues to invite discussion concerns the documented psychiatric evaluations completed before the murders began. Following his earlier convictions for kidnapping and sexually assaulting teenage boys, mental health professionals described Bonin as an individual presenting a high risk of future violence. Those assessments later became part of broader conversations regarding rehabilitation, supervision, and public safety. Yet experts have consistently cautioned against interpreting such evaluations as predictions of inevitable future crimes. Risk assessment informs decision-making, but cannot determine future behavior with certainty. Likewise, Bonin's troubled childhood, marked by instability, violence, neglect, and possible abuse, provides context without providing justification. Investigators and psychologists repeatedly stressed that countless individuals experience severe childhood trauma without becoming violent offenders. Recognizing difficult life circumstances should never diminish personal accountability for deliberate criminal acts. Bonin alone remained responsible for the choices that led to the suffering of his victims. Perhaps the most meaningful legacy of the freeway killer investigation lies in its continued emphasis on the victims rather than the offender. Famous criminal cases often risk becoming centered on those who committed the violence, allowing the identities of victims to fade into the background. Responsible historical examination requires the opposite approach. Every victim represented a unique individual whose life contained hopes, relationships, and opportunities that ended far too soon. Families endured not only devastating loss, but also prolonged uncertainty while investigations unfolded across multiple counties. Many spent months searching for answers before learning the fate of their loved ones. Court proceedings required them to confront painful evidence repeatedly as prosecutors reconstructed the crimes in meticulous detail. Their perseverance throughout that process deserves recognition alongside the investigative work that ultimately brought Bonin to justice. William Bonin was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison on February 23, 1996, concluding the legal proceedings against him. Witnesses reported that he offered neither a final confession regarding additional crimes nor expressions of remorse toward the victims. His execution ended the state's responsibility for carrying out the sentence imposed by the courts. But it did not erase the consequences of the murders or the questions surrounding the exact number of lives affected. The historical record therefore distinguishes carefully between the 14 murders for which Bonin was convicted, the 21 killings he admitted, and the additional victims investigators believed might also have been connected to him. Maintaining those distinctions reflects the same commitment to factual accuracy that guided the prosecution throughout the case. Ultimately, the story of William Bonin is not a story about the mythology of a serial killer. It is a case study in how determined investigative work overcame jurisdictional barriers, how forensic evidence and careful documentation transformed suspicion into proof, and how cooperation between agencies evolved in response to an extraordinarily complex series of crimes. Above all, it is a reminder that justice is measured not by the notoriety of an offender, but by the commitment to uncovering the truth with accuracy, fairness, and respect for those who suffered the greatest loss. The highways that once concealed Bonin's movements eventually became the threads connecting dozens of investigators to a single conclusion. Through persistence, collaboration, and unwavering attention to evidence, they ensured that the freeway killer's crimes would not remain hidden indefinitely. The victims deserve to be remembered not as anonymous figures within a famous criminal investigation, but as young lives whose stories continue to shape the pursuit of justice, the evolution of criminal investigation, and the enduring responsibility to protect the vulnerable wherever opportunities for violence may exist. The story of William George Bonin reached its legal conclusion with his execution in 1996. But the questions, lessons, and consequences surrounding the case continued long after the prison gates of San Quentin closed behind him. The freeway killer investigation had begun as a collection of separate tragedies scattered across Southern California. A missing teenager in one community, a body discovered beside a highway in another county, a family searching desperately for answers, and detectives working with only fragments of information. Over time, those fragments were connected through cooperation, persistence, and careful examination of evidence. The transformation from disconnected investigations into one of California's most significant serial murder cases demonstrated both the difficulties of confronting a mobile offender and the importance of adapting investigative methods when traditional approaches are not enough. The crimes committed by Bonin exposed a painful reality for investigators. A dangerous offender could exploit the divisions between law enforcement agencies. Southern California's extensive freeway system, which allowed millions of people to travel quickly between cities every day, also allowed Bonin to move victims and abandoned bodies across multiple jurisdictions. The very geography that connected communities also complicated the investigation. When a victim was discovered beside a highway, detectives had to determine not only who the victim was and how the person died, but also where the abduction occurred, where the assault took place, and whether another agency possessed related information. Before the connections became clear, each department naturally focused on crimes within its own territory. The Bonin case demonstrated that geography could become one of the greatest challenges in modern criminal investigations. The eventual formation of a coordinated task force represented a major shift in how investigators approached the case. Instead of allowing information to remain isolated, agencies began comparing reports, evidence, victim descriptions, and forensic findings. The similarities became impossible to ignore. The victims shared comparable ages and backgrounds. Many had been approached while alone. Their deaths showed repeated patterns of restraint and violence. Their bodies were abandoned near major highways. The investigation revealed that the individual cases were not separate tragedies but parts of a larger pattern created by one offender. This realization changed the direction of the investigation completely. Detectives were no longer searching for unrelated killers. They were searching for a single person responsible for a continuing series of crimes. The arrest of Bonin demonstrated the importance of combining different types of evidence. His own statements provided investigators with information about the scope of his crimes. But those admissions were only one element of the prosecution's case. Physical evidence recovered from his van, forensic examinations of victims, witness testimony, and statements from other individuals connected to the crimes all played crucial roles. The investigation showed that successful prosecutions depend on more than identifying a suspect. They require building a complete and reliable chain of evidence capable of proving responsibility in court. In a case involving numerous victims and multiple jurisdictions, that process demanded extraordinary attention to detail. Bonin's case also reinforced the importance of listening to survivors. Before the murders began, Bonin had already committed serious sexual offenses against teenage boys. Some victims of those earlier attacks survived and later provided information that helped establish his pattern of behavior. Their experiences contributed to understanding how he selected victims, how he gained control, and how his methods developed over time. Although their assaults occurred before the murder series, their testimony became an important part of the broader picture. Survivors often provide information that cannot be found in physical evidence alone. Their voices help investigators understand not only what happened, but how an offender operated. The involvement of accomplices added another layer of complexity to the case. Unlike many serial offenders who act completely alone, Bonin was connected to several individuals who participated in some crimes. Vernon Butts, Vernon Dodd, James Monroe, and William Pugh were identified as accomplices involved at different times and to different degrees. Their participation demonstrated that investigations involving serial violence may require examining entire networks rather than focusing only on one individual. At the same time, investigators remained careful to distinguish between the actions of Bonin and those of others. Not every accomplice participated in every crime, and each person's responsibility had to be evaluated based on available evidence. This careful distinction was essential to maintaining accuracy throughout the prosecution. The case also contributed to broader discussions about criminal justice decisions involving repeat offenders. Years before Bonin became known as the freeway killer, he had already been convicted of serious crimes involving teenage victims. Mental health professionals had expressed concerns about his dangerousness, and later events led to questions about how authorities evaluate and manage individuals with histories of violent behavior. However, the case also demonstrated the complexity of predicting future actions. Risk assessments can identify warning signs, but they cannot eliminate uncertainty. Criminal justice systems must continually balance public safety, rehabilitation, legal standards, and individual rights. The Bonin case remains part of those discussions because it represents one of the most tragic outcomes of a situation where previous warning signs existed. At the same time, the case serves as a reminder that background circumstances do not determine destiny. Information about Bonin's childhood describes a life marked by violence, neglect, instability, and possible abuse. Those experiences may provide context for understanding aspects of his development, but they do not explain away or excuse his actions. Many people endure difficult childhood experiences without committing violent crimes. The responsibility for the murders belonged to Bonin and the choices he made as an adult. Maintaining that distinction is important because it prevents society from confusing explanation with justification. Perhaps the greatest responsibility in remembering the freeway killer case is ensuring that attention remains focused on the victims. The name William Bonin became widely known, but the lives of those he killed are the true center of the story. They were young people with families, relationships, and futures. They were not merely numbers in an investigation or evidence in a courtroom. Each victim represented a person whose life had meaning beyond the circumstances of their death. The work of investigators and prosecutors was ultimately performed on behalf of those victims and the families who continued searching for justice. For many families, justice arrived slowly. Investigations took time. Trials required years of preparation. The legal process forced relatives to repeatedly revisit painful details. Even after Bonin's conviction and execution, grief remained. A sentence can punish an offender, but it cannot undo the harm caused or return someone who was lost. This reality is one of the most difficult truths in cases involving severe violence. Justice can provide accountability, but it cannot restore what was taken. The freeway killer investigation also changed how law enforcement viewed crimes committed across jurisdictional boundaries. The lessons learned encouraged stronger cooperation between agencies, greater attention to shared databases and information exchange, and increased awareness of behavioral patterns connecting separate cases. The investigation became an example of how persistence and collaboration can overcome the challenges created by geography and limited information. It showed that even when an offender attempts to hide behind complexity, patterns eventually emerge. Decades later, the Bonin case remains one of the darkest chapters in California criminal history. It is studied not because of fascination with the offender, but because it demonstrates the importance of prevention, investigation, and accountability. It reveals the devastating consequences that occur when a dangerous individual continues to harm vulnerable victims. It also demonstrates the dedication required from investigators, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and families who refuse to allow those victims to disappear into forgotten files. The final legacy of the freeway killer case is therefore not the identity of William Bonin. It is the commitment to remembering those who were lost, learning from investigative failures, improving systems designed to protect communities, and ensuring that future victims receive the attention and justice they deserve. The highways of Southern California once served as the backdrop for fear and uncertainty. Through the efforts of countless people seeking the truth, those same routes became part of the evidence that finally revealed the pattern behind the crimes. The case remains a reminder that even in the most complex investigations, careful work, cooperation, and respect for victims can ultimately bring hidden truths into the light. The conclusion of the William Bonin case did not arrive with the simple closing of a courtroom file or the turning of a prison key. Although his execution in 1996 marked the official end of the state's legal process against him, the impact of his crimes continued to influence victims' families, investigators, criminal justice professionals, and the public understanding of serial violence. The freeway killer case became more than a record of 14 murder convictions or a collection of disturbing evidence presented during multiple trials. It became a case study in how communities respond when confronted with a hidden threat, how investigators adapt when crimes cross jurisdictional boundaries, and how the pursuit of justice depends on recognizing the humanity of those whose lives were taken. For many years, the name William Bonin became associated with fear throughout Southern California. The nickname Freeway Killer reflected the method that connected many of the crimes victims discovered near highways across different counties. However, the highways themselves were never the true center of the story. They were only the locations where investigators eventually found evidence of a much larger tragedy. The real story existed in the lives of the victims, the families searching for answers, and the investigators attempting to understand why so many young people had disappeared under similar circumstances. The roads that once represented uncertainty later became part of the trail that revealed the truth. The investigation demonstrated how difficult it can be to identify a serial offender when crimes are scattered across different communities. In the early stages, detectives were confronted with individual cases rather than an obvious pattern. Each missing person report and each body discovered beside a highway represented a separate tragedy, requiring immediate attention. Without a complete picture, investigators could not immediately recognize that these events were connected. It was only through careful comparison of evidence and cooperation between agencies that the larger pattern became visible. The case showed that information sharing is not simply an administrative convenience. In complex criminal investigations, it can determine whether future victims are protected, and whether an offender is identified before more harm occurs. The importance of cooperation became one of the strongest lessons from the investigation. Different police departments possessed different pieces of information. One agency might have knowledge about a victim's disappearance, while another held evidence from a body discovered within its jurisdiction. Only by combining those pieces could investigators see the full scope of what had happened. The formation of the task force represented a recognition that traditional boundaries were insufficient when confronting a criminal who moved freely across county lines. The success of the investigation reinforced the need for law enforcement agencies to work together. Whenever patterns suggest that crimes may be connected, the case also demonstrated the essential role of evidence-based investigation. Bonin's own admissions provided investigators with significant information, but prosecutors did not rely on those statements alone. They built their cases through forensic evidence, physical evidence, witness accounts, and carefully documented investigative findings. This approach was especially important because the number of suspected crimes was much larger than the number of cases that could be proven in court. Investigators had to separate confirmed facts from possibilities. The distinction between what Bonin admitted, what investigators suspected, and what prosecutors could establish beyond a reasonable doubt remained a central principle throughout the legal process. The trials also revealed the enormous responsibility involved in prosecuting a case with multiple victims. Each victim required individual attention. Each family deserved recognition. Each charge required evidence capable of meeting the highest legal standards. Prosecutors faced the difficult task of presenting a broad pattern of violence while also proving the specific circumstances of individual murders. The successful convictions reflected years of work by detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and witnesses who contributed to the effort to establish the truth. While the criminal justice system ultimately held Bonin accountable, the case also raised difficult questions about prevention. Years before the murders occurred, Bonin had already been convicted of serious sexual offenses involving teenage boys. Mental health professionals had documented concerns regarding his behavior and potential danger. After the murders became known, these earlier events became part of broader discussions about how society responds to individuals who demonstrate repeated patterns of violent behavior. The case encouraged examination of how risk assessments are conducted, how offenders are supervised after release, and how public safety considerations are balanced within the legal system. However, the lessons from Bonin's history must be approached carefully. His childhood involved instability, neglect, violence, and possible abuse. But those circumstances cannot be viewed as a direct explanation for his crimes. Many people experience trauma without becoming violent offenders. Understanding an individual's background can provide context, but it does not remove responsibility for harmful choices. The actions that led to the suffering of his victims were the result of decisions made by Bonin himself. Acknowledging this distinction prevents the discussion from shifting blame away from the person responsible. The victims remain the most important part of the case's historical record. In discussions of serial murder, there is often a risk that the offender becomes the central figure because of the attention surrounding the crimes. Yet the true measure of any investigation should be the people it seeks to protect and remember. The young victims of William Bonin were more than the circumstances of their deaths. They were sons, brothers, friends, classmates, and members of their communities. They had individual personalities, hopes, and futures that were taken away. Their families carried the consequences of those losses long after the legal proceedings ended. The passage of time has not erased the significance of those lives. Every improvement in investigative coordination, every lesson learned about recognizing patterns, and every advancement in protecting vulnerable individuals represents part of the continuing response to tragedies such as this one. The purpose of remembering cases like the freeway killer investigation is not to preserve the reputation of an offender. It is to ensure that the suffering of victims leads to greater awareness and better protection for others. The Bonin case also changed public understanding of how ordinary circumstances can be exploited by dangerous individuals. Bonin appeared to operate within everyday environments. He drove through familiar streets, traveled on common highways, and interacted with people in situations that did not immediately appear threatening. This reality made the crimes especially disturbing because it challenged assumptions about where danger could exist. The case became a reminder that predators may not always appear unusual or obviously threatening. They can exist within ordinary surroundings, making awareness, communication, and protection of vulnerable individuals essential. At the same time, the investigation demonstrated that offenders who attempt to hide behind complexity can still be identified. Bonin attempted to benefit from movement, distance, and fragmented information. He relied on the assumption that crimes committed in different locations would remain disconnected. Investigators ultimately proved otherwise. Through cooperation and persistence, they reconstructed the pattern and connected the evidence. The case became an example of how determination can overcome obstacles created by geography and uncertainty. The execution of William Bonin in 1996 ended the state's pursuit of punishment. But the broader lessons of the case remain. The investigation influenced future approaches to serial crimes, encouraged stronger collaboration between agencies, and reinforced the importance of focusing on victims throughout the justice process. The case continues to be studied not because of the offender's notoriety, but because it demonstrates the challenges faced by investigators and the responsibility to learn from past failures. In the end, the story of William Bonin is a story of tragedy, investigation, and accountability. It is a story of young lives lost, families forever changed, and investigators who worked across boundaries to uncover the truth. It is also a reminder that justice requires more than identifying a criminal. It requires remembering those who suffered, examining the systems that failed to protect them, and improving those systems so that future victims may be spared. The Freeway Killer case remains one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in American history, but its lasting significance should not be defined solely by the violence committed. Its deeper legacy lies in the response that followed, the cooperation between investigators, the dedication of those seeking justice, and the commitment to ensuring that the victims are never reduced to statistics. Behind every case file, every piece of evidence, and every courtroom decision were real people whose lives mattered. Remembering them remains the most important part of understanding William Bonin's crimes and the lessons left behind.